While Legion fell victim of some polarizing design decisions, its raid content is still highly regarded as some of the best in the entire game. And in this video, we're going to go over some of the most unique and memorable raid mechanics released during WoW's 6th expansion. And at number 7, we have Cenarius and his Nightmare Brambles. Cenarius was the penultimate boss of Legion's first raid, the Emerald Nightmare. One of his more simple sounded abilities is called Nightmare Brambles. This ability spawns a circle of roots next to a random player, and after a short while, these roots will start to chase the targeted player through the arena, creating more and more roots in its path. Coming into contact with either the chasing circle or the roots it left behind in its trail will deal damage to the player and root them. So what the player had to do was kite the brambles out of the raid, making sure the trails didn't block any important routes or hit other players. After that was done, one of the players with an immunity had to run through the roots on the ground, thus clearing them and making sure the raid had enough space to continue the fight. What made this rather basic mechanic unique? There was no indicator which player was targeted by the chasing circle. And as if this wasn't hard enough to adapt to a game that is mostly about tracking mechanics by using add-ons, the roots also swapped targets randomly. None so far has been able to map out the pattern of this ability, making it one of the few things in WoW that is not trackable by anyone and fully random. But because Nightmare Brambles are on their own fairly simple, and wouldn't be remembered by most players if they were tracked by add-ons, they only place at the bottom of this list. Staying in the Emerald Nightmare, at number 6 on this list we have the final boss of the raid, Xavius, and his Nightmare Corruption. At the beginning of the fight, a bar will appear on the bottom of the player's screen. This bar indicates the level of Nightmare Corruption individual players are inflicted with. This Nightmare Corruption interacted in multiple ways with players throughout the fight, and filled up whenever a player was hit by these boss's abilities, something that was unavoidable for some of them. After a player reached 33 corruption, so-called Dread Abominations will start to create AoE damage zones on the ground, forcing the player to move. The Dread Abominations themselves were untargetable, but their spawn area will indicate where the next damage marker was going to appear. The important part was that these zones were fully unique to the player that saw them. The same goes for 66 corruption, at which point small damage circles will spawn much more frequently in addition to the big ones. At 100 corruption, the player would descend into madness, gaining a massive damage and healing buff for 20 seconds. After the 20 seconds were over, the player would die. But there was a twist. You see, at 2 points in the fight, 95% and 60%, the Spirit of the Green Dragon aspect Ysera would put the physical bodies of half the raid to sleep, marking their locations and allow them to fight as a dreaming simulacrum. When a player in the dream would die, they would instead just wake up, getting repositioned to where their physical bodies fell asleep. This process also did reset health, mana, and most importantly, all cooldowns the players were using during their time in the dream. What made this mechanic unique? The second life and the cooldown reset that the players in the dream were granted meant that those who were put to sleep weren't just responsible to protect players in the waking world from corruption, they were actively encouraged to do so. Not only would they prevent their fellow raid members outside the dream from dying, the damage buff at 100 corruption in addition to the reset of all the players' cooldowns created massive damage windows. Keep in mind that this was during Legion, a time where Shadow Priests had access to Surrender to Madness, famously the most overpowered cooldown of all time, that killed the user when it ends. The fact that certain boss abilities were voluntarily soakable by players sometimes even resulted in multiple players fighting for an ad soak so they could increase the corruption faster. For instance, to line up their cooldowns with the damage window at 100 corruption. While we had some revive mechanics since then, none of them reset cooldowns or only affected half the raid at a time. But those factors alone aren't enough to compete with the higher numbers on this list, so Xavius' corruption only ranks at number 6. Going from the first raid in Legion to the last, we have Varimathras, the 8th boss of Antoran, the Burning Throne. Varimathras' entire fight revolved around the interplay of two different abilities, Misery and Alone in the Dark. Misery is a fairly straightforward debuff that increases physical damage taken and prevents healing on a player for 7 seconds each time the player takes shadow damage. Alone in the Dark causes Varimathras to deal shadow damage to players whenever they aren't in 8-yard range of an allied player. Additionally, on Heroic and upwards, there was an area-wide effect that changed every 2 minutes, dealing a different kind of damage every second. In the first minutes, it just dealt fire damage for the healers to deal with. The second damage type was frost damage, and applied at 40% on the entire raid. The third damage type was fell damage, slowing down to deal damage every 5 seconds, but increasing in severity by 50% each time it dealt damage. And the fourth and final damage type was Shadow, instantly affecting the entire raid with Misery, making them immune to being healed and acted as the soften rage for the encounter. Now, what makes this mechanic unique? Despite the easy to understand premise of the abilities, the encounter was quite challenging, forcing players to act as a unit and make sure no one gets left behind. For instance, one of the boss abilities, Dark Fissures, would create void zones under 3 players in the raid, forcing the entire raid to move from one side of the boss to the other, while making sure to stay within 8 yards of each other. This heavily punished ill-timed uses of movement abilities like Blink, especially while the 40% slow was active, because players could easily end up too far ahead of the raid. In the Heroic and Mythic versions, the boss is also able to cast the ability Necrotic Embrace. This ability would mark one player in the raid, dealing shadow damage to them after 6 seconds, applied misery, and spreading to anyone within 10 yards and thus wiping the raid immediately. Not only did the marked player have to move out of the raid, the healers also needed to make sure he was topped off before he could leave the raid, as doing so would make him immune to receiving healing before taking the high damage from Necrotic Embrace. Moving as a unit wasn't exactly new to WoW's encounter design, but Varimathras was by far the most claustrophobic iteration of this style of tightly choreographed dance fights. And at number 4, we have Kil'Jaeden finding Illidan. Still regarded as one of the hardest bosses in WoW's lifetime, we have the final boss of the Tomb of Sargeras, Legion's 3rd raid. This encounter had 5 different stages, 3 phases where you would actively fight the boss, and 2 intermissions. In each phase, the boss would gain more abilities added upon the already existing set of mechanics that players had to deal with. But for this list, we'll look at the one point in the fight that doesn't contain any of the abilities used elsewhere during the fight. The second intermission of the fight right before the 3rd and final phase of the encounter. As he transitioned, Kil'Jaeden would disappear and multiple Shadow Soul adds would spawn within the area. Shortly afterwards, the players would be engulfed in darkness, which massively limited the player's viewing distance and prevented them from healing or dealing damage. Simultaneously, the Shadow adds will start chain casting destabilizing Shadow Soul, dealing damage to the entire raid. The darkness effect was able to be lessened by finding Illidan in the arena, who randomly spawned right as the phase began. The players need to walk within the circle around him, which applied a refreshable dot on them, enabling the ability to see through the darkness and restore the capability of healing or dealing damage. After all adds had been killed, the phase would end and Kil'Jaeden would be attackable once again. What made this mechanic unique? While the players had to deal with limited visibility from being enveloped by darkness, the UI elements of the game weren't affected by anything. This made the minimap and its ping system extremely valuable for coordinating within the raid. Once one player was able to find Illidan, they would just be able to spam click on themselves in the minimap, noticing the rest of the raid of Illidan's position. Additionally, hunters could bring a massive advantage for this fight. You see, hunters have the unique skill to track most creature types on their minimap, one of them being humanoids. And Illidan did count as a humanoid. So what hunters could do is just start clicking on the minimap as soon as Illidan's indicator would appear on there. This enabled the entire raid to move straight to him and thus reduce the time in complete darkness significantly. While Illidan's position was important, the players also had to track the positions of the Shadow Soul adds. While the dot they could gain by being close to Illidan would reduce the darkness, it wouldn't completely remove it, thus making it still be necessary to seek out the adds scattered across the arena. Blizzard so far hasn't tried anything like this again. This might be because Kil'Jaeden's encounter was brutally difficult, making it controversial in the eyes of certain parts of the WoW community. But its uniqueness in the field of intermissions makes it stand out regardless of its difficulty, thus earning a place on this list. And at number 3, we have Antoran High Command, the Pod. Returning to the final rated expansion, we have the 3rd boss of Antoris, the Antoran High Command. The Antoran High Command is made up of 3 different bosses that share 1 health bar: Admiral Xavius, Chief Engineer Ishkar, and General Eridus. While only one of them was active and damageable, the other 2 are inside of their command pod, where they would gain specific abilities to influence the encounter from a distance. While outside of the pod, the 3 bosses only had 1 shared move, a tank hit that increased physical damage taken and forces a tank swap. While inside of the pod, each boss would gain 1 shared and 1 unique ability. This shared ability was called Chaos Pulse, dealing damage to random raid members and increasing their damage taken by 15 seconds. The unique abilities for each of these bosses are as follows. While Chief Engineer Ishkar was in the pod, he would periodically spawn entropic mines close to random players. These mines would take a couple of seconds to become active, after which they would detonate on contact, dealing heavy damage to the player who touched them and applying a stacking dot on the raid. General Eridus' pod ability was called Summon Reinforcements and did exactly that, spawning in a number of adds that either casted an interruptible Pyroblast or Bladestorm across the arena, needing to be avoided. The last pod, piloted by Admiral Xavius, granted her the ability Fusillade, a massive raid-wide AoE that increased in damage each time she would use it, creating a softened rage for the encounter. Now, what made this mechanic unique? One boss being active at all time meant that one pod was also accessible for players to enter, gaining access to 2 abilities. One shared one, Chaos Pulse, that dealt damage to and increased the damage they took, and one that resembled the ability of the original pilot. The ability for each pod was specifically designed to hard counter one of the pod abilities of the other 2 bosses. The Admiral's pod ability allowed the usage of Withering Fire, a controllable burst AoE that dealt massive damage to summon demons and increased their damage taken, while the Engineer's pod was able to place a shield generator, which upon activation would create a damage reduction zone against the damage of Fusillade. Players in the General's pod were able to call in Disruptor Beacons that would pulse the disruption field for 7 seconds, interrupting enemy spellcasters and slowing them down, while also getting rid of entropic mines. This resulted in a fight that was built around pre-planning the encounter well, placing multiple shield generators in advance around the room and smartly clearing out the mines while having access to Disruptor Beacon. And all of this is done from a static vehicle. And at number 2, we have Imonar the Soul Hunter, the 6th boss of Antoris. To understand Imonar the Soul Hunter as a boss fight, we first need to take a look at the arena he's fought in. Behind the platform the fight starts on is a long bridge and a second platform mirroring the starting one. Every 33%, or 20% of Mythic, Imonar becomes immune to all damage and jumps across the bridge, scattering multiple different traps along the bridge and starts a channel. While this channel is active, he hurls burning balls across the bridge, rolling in a straight line. If he isn't interrupted within 2 minutes, the raid wipes. Now, what makes this mechanic unique? Imonar's bridge is a death trap of choices. Stasis traps that stun players for 8 seconds, pulse grenades that knock back all players hit, causing them to hit more traps or fall off the bridge, and sharpnel mines and blast wires dealing massive damage to either the player who stepped on them or the entire raid. All of this while the players have to dodge the burning balls coming towards them. But the tricky part was, the raid had to cross the bridge multiple times and traps did not despawn. So each time the boss crossed the bridge, a new layer of traps would be placed upon the last, increasing the difficulty of each intermission massively. One silver lining the players had was the fact that some classes were able to use an immunity and run in front of the raid, clearing at least some of the traps in the way to carve out a path for the gauntlet. Imonar's gauntlet might be one of the most interesting and well-executed mechanics Blizzard introduced in Legion, but it doesn't come close to the most unique boss they made in Legion, or even the entire game. Undefeated the #1 spot is the 9th boss of Legion's second raid, the Nighthold Grand Magister Elisande. Elisande also appears on our top 10 interesting raid mechanics in World of Warcraft list I did a couple of years ago. Given she is a time mage, it makes sense that she pops up again years later. But let's take a close look at the fight. 2 things that were important. Firstly, there were 2 adds, a purple and a blue one. Both would create a bubble when it died. The blue bubble would slow everything it touches for a set time. The purple one did the opposite. Secondly, 2 times after Elisande reaches 10% health, she resets herself in time back to full health and leaves behind an echo of herself. The echo will repeat each ability she cast at the position she held while it was casted the first time. For the first health bar, the echo abilities were a ring of damage that Elisande pulls towards her, and some void zones that grow smaller whenever a player took a damage tick from them. Once she resets herself for the first time, her ability set would change. Now, the players had to spread lasers and catch orbs from the sky, the latter of which would also echo into the last phase. Speaking of which, in the last phase, players would be afflicted by 2 different kinds of debuffs. Permulative Torment would be taken for rampant damage, while Conflexive Burst would deal massive raid damage after 30 seconds. What made the mechanic unique, the speed up and slow down zone as well as the echo. You see, everything the bubbles touch would be altered. Segments of the ring from the first phase would slow down or speed up depending on what bubble they touched and stayed altered in the following echoes. And for the players, not only was their attack, cast, and movement speed changed, but also the speed of which cooldowns were covered and hots and dots ticked. The latter was extremely important, because being slowed down was vital to soak the void zones, as healing them within them with the normal damage tick rate was almost impossible. And for the last phase, not making sure the raid-wide damage from Conflex's burst was spread out was lethal and almost certainly meant a wipe. In addition, good players were able to abuse the gains they received from the speed-up zone nearly permanently throughout the entire fight, creating an extremely enjoyable environment for re-clears and farm raids. This resulted in time mechanics being well liked by the community to this day, leading to Blizzard reusing similar ideas multiple times, most recently in the Dawn of the Infinite Mega Dungeon and Dragonflight. This results in Elisande's time manipulation taking the first spot on this list, by cementing a legacy in the expansions to come. Alright, and that's the list. Do you know of any other raid mechanics I may have missed in Legion? Or would you like a similar list for another expansion? Or have an entirely different video idea like this one? If so, let us know about those down in the comments below.